At my sister Jasmine's engagement dinner. My mother smiled at her future wealthy in-laws and pointed directly at me. This is our other daughter, Jada. She cleans houses for a living. My father laughed and added that they had completely given up on me years ago. The room went dead silent. The groom's mother, a ruthless real estate mogul, stared at me, all the color draining from her face. She whispered my name in pure terror. My parents had no idea. They had just insulted the woman who held the financial keys to the entire Sterling family empire. If you have ever been treated like the family disappointment only to have the ultimate upper hand, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe to hear exactly how I made them pay for every single insult. The Monarch Room in downtown Atlanta is the kind of restaurant where the waitstaff wear tailored suits and the menus do not have prices. It is a place designed to make people feel important, which is exactly why my mother Brenda chose it for this dinner. I arrived 10 minutes early, checking my coat with the hostess and smoothing down my simple black dress. At 35, I had learned that true wealth whispers while insecurity screams. My family was currently screaming at the center table in the main dining room. I walked over quietly, observing the scene before making my presence known. My parents, Brenda and Richard, were practically vibrating with desperation to impress. They were obsessed with their standing in Atlanta's upper-middle-class Black society, constantly chasing the illusion of Black excellence. My younger sister Jasmine sat at the center of the table, perfectly coiffed and wearing a designer dress I knew she could not afford. She was 32 to a mid-level public relations manager and currently drowning in credit card debt to maintain her facade. Sitting next to her was Julian Sterling, her 4-year-old fiancé. Julian was white, polite, and came from generations of legacy wealth. He seemed completely oblivious to the financial reality of the woman he was about to marry. When I finally stepped up to the table, my mother barely looked at me. She gestured vaguely toward the far end of the table, as far away from the Sterling family as physically possible. "Sit there, Jada," she murmured, without breaking her gaze away from Julian. I took my seat in silence. I did not complain. I simply observed. For my entire life, I had been the family scapegoat. I rejected their obsession with corporate titles and country club memberships. When I started my own business years ago, my parents wrote me off as a failure because I refused to follow their rigid path. They told everyone I was a blue-collar laborer. They had no idea that I am the founder and CEO of Sterling and Oak Estate Management. My firm is an ultra-exclusive agency that manages multi-million-dollar properties for America's elite. I do not clean houses. I manage the people who clean the mansions of billionaires, but I never corrected my parents. I let them believe what they wanted because it kept them out of my bank accounts. Throughout the first 2 courses, Jasmine performed her perfect successful daughter routine effortlessly. She exaggerated her role at her PR firm, claiming to lead national campaigns while our parents nodded enthusiastically, backing up every lie. Julian listened with a loving smile, completely taken in by the illusion. I ate my salad in silence, watching the performance unfold. The dynamic was so familiar, it was exhausting. I was the invisible daughter, the embarrassing secret they had to hide at the end of the table. Just as the main courses were being cleared, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Caroline Sterling had arrived. Julian's mother was a formidable woman, a high-net-worth real estate mogul known for her ruthless business tactics and icy demeanor. She swept into the restaurant wearing an immaculate pantsuit, demanding attention simply by existing. My parents immediately stood up, practically tripping over themselves to greet her. Brenda rushed forward, her voice pitching an octave higher as she welcomed Caroline to the table. Caroline accepted the greetings with a polite but distant smile, taking the empty seat next to her son. Brenda seized the moment to reintroduce everyone, determined to cement the narrative of our perfect family. She went on for 5 solid minutes about Jasmine proudly listing fake accolades and exaggerated accomplishments. Caroline nodded, sipping her sparkling water, looking mildly bored. Then Caroline's gaze drifted down the length of the long table and landed on me. She narrowed her eyes slightly, trying to place my face. Brenda noticed the direction of Caroline's stare and immediately panicked. Her perfect image was being threatened by my mere presence. "Oh, Caroline," Brenda said with a forced, high-pitched laugh. "This is our other daughter, Jada. She just cleans houses for a living. Nothing glamorous like Jasmine." "My father," Richard immediately chimed in, eager to prove they shared Caroline's high standards. "Yes, we have completely given up on her," he said, shaking his head with a disappointed sigh. "She never had the drive for a real career." We just pray she can pay her rent every month." I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I simply looked right into Caroline Sterling's eyes. I saw the exact moment recognition hit her. Just 6 months ago, my firm had saved Caroline's sprawling Hampton estate from a catastrophic multi-million-dollar zoning disaster. I personally hold the non-disclosure agreements and manage the financial lifelines to her most private, sensitive real estate holdings. I know exactly how much debt the Sterling Empire is hiding, and I know exactly how much power I have over her. Caroline froze. The glass of sparkling water halted halfway to her mouth. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She stared at me, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I gave her a look. It was a subtle microscopic narrowing of my eyes. A silent, icy warning that communicated a very clear message. Do not blow my cover. Do not say a word about who I really am. Caroline swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. Wait, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. You are. She stopped. The entire table locked up. The silence was deafening. My parents looked back and forth between Caroline and me, absolute confusion washing over their faces. Brenda's fake smile faltered. Richard leaned forward, unsure of what was happening. Jada is Caroline stammered frantically, trying to recalibrate her tone. Jada is an incredible young woman. We are so very honored to have her here tonight. She offered me a deep, respectful nod that bordered on a bow. The sudden, bizarre amount of respect coming from a woman like Caroline Sterling thoroughly confused my parents. Brenda lost all color in her face. Richard blinked rapidly, his mouth hanging slightly open. Jasmine glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure venom. How dare I command the respect of her wealthy future mother-in-law? How dare the woman who cleans houses receive a beau from a real estate mogul? To punish me for somehow stealing her spotlight, Jasmine decided to orchestrate another humiliation. When the waiter brought the leather folder containing the bill for the evening, he placed it near the center of the table. The total was $4,500. Jasmine picked it up, made a show of patting her designer purse, and sighed loudly. Oh no, she said, pouting at Julian. I must have left my wallet in my other bag. Dad, can you cover this? Richard looked at this bill, his eyes widening slightly at the total before a cruel smile spread across his face. He picked up the leather folder and slid it all the way down the table until it rested directly in front of me. Since you do not have a real career, Jada, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, maybe you can go to the back and scrub the restaurant kitchen to pay this off. Consider it your contribution to your sister's happiness. Brenda chuckled a mean, sharp sound. Jasmine smiled triumphantly. Julian looked incredibly uncomfortable, but said nothing clearly, not wanting to intervene in a family dispute. Caroline looked like she might actually pass out from the sheer second-hand panic of watching my family insult me. I did not say a word. I calmly reached into my clutch and pulled out my solid black American Express Centurion card. I placed it on top of the bill and handed it to the waiter who had been standing awkwardly nearby. The waiter glanced at the card, then looked at the name printed on the front. His eyes widened. He recognized my name instantly. My estate management firm handled the private catering contracts for the restaurant's owner. Miss Williams, the waiter, said, his voice dropping to a hushed, respectful tone. It is an absolute honor to have you dining with us tonight. The owner has explicitly instructed us that your meals are always on the house. I will take care of your portion immediately. He smoothly removed the card from the folder, handed it back to me with a slight bow, and turned to my parents. For the remainder of the party, he said coldly, the balance is $3,800. How would you like to pay? My father's face turned a mottled shade of red. He fumbled for his wallet, completely humiliated by the waiter's dismissal. Brenda looked like she had swallowed a lemon, Jasmine's face contorted with fury. She leaned across the table, her voice a harsh whisper meant only for me. You think you are so special because you got a free meal, she hissed. You embarrassed us in front of Julian's mother. You owe me. Since you clean houses, you can clean my wedding venue for free. I expect you there tomorrow morning to scrub the floors. I looked at my sister, watching the desperation and entitlement war on her face. I smiled a slow, calm smile that didn't reach my eyes. I would be happy to take a look at the venue tomorrow, Jasmine, I said softly. I agreed to her demand without hesitation. I knew exactly which historic Atlanta estate she had booked for her dream wedding, and she had absolutely no idea that I was the one who actually owned the property. By Sunday afternoon, Jasmine had decided her wedding would cost exactly $150,000. She announced this figure in the middle of my parents' living room as if she were reading the daily weather forecast. She paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, waving a thick binder filled with venue printouts, imported floral arrangements, and catering menus that featured gold leaf truffles and caviar stations. "We have to show the Steerings who we are," Jasmine declared, slapping the binder onto the coffee table. "Julian comes from old money. His mother, Caroline, expects a certain caliber of event. If we do a cheap hotel ballroom, they will laugh at us behind our backs. We are the Williams family. We represent Black excellence. I will not look like a charity case walking down the aisle." My mother, Brenda, sat on the plush sofa, clutching her wine glass like a lifeline. She nodded vigorously, completely captivated by the delusion. "You are absolutely right, Jasmine. We have an image to uphold in Atlanta. We belong in the same social circles as the Steerings, and your wedding will be the social event of the season. No one will ever look down on us." I sat quietly in the corner armchair, sipping my water. I watched my father, Richard. Unlike Bren, his face was glistening with a thin layer of cold sweat. His jaw was clenched so tight I could practically hear his teeth grinding. $150,000 is a massive amount of cash for a family that relies on a mid-level managerial pension and credit cards to fund their luxury car leases. He knew they did not have the money. I knew they were already stretched thin, just keeping up appearances at their country club. But Richard was too arrogant and too terrified of losing face to admit he was broke. Richard cleared his throat, forcing a stiff, unnatural smile. "We will make it happen, princess. Your mother and I will handle the finances. You just focus on looking beautiful for Julian." Then Richard turned his gaze to me. The fake smile instantly vanished, replaced by his usual look of bitter disappointment. "As for you, Jada," he snapped, "you heard your sister at the restaurant last night. Since you cannot contribute financially to this family, you will contribute with manual labor. Jasmine needs the venue scrubbed, the chairs polished, and the baseboards dusted before the decorators arrive. Do not embarrass us by being lazy." I looked at him. I looked at the man who was willing to bankrupt his entire future for a party, yet had the audacity to call me a failure. I did not argue. I simply nodded, placed my water glass on a coaster, and walked out the front door. On Monday morning, I sat behind my custom mahogany desk in the penthouse suite of the Sterling and Oak Estate Management Building in Buckhead. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline, a city where I silently controlled tens of millions of dollars in premium real estate. I was reviewing quarterly profit margins when my chief operating officer, Calvin, knocked and entered my office. Calvin is brilliant, sharply dressed, and fiercely loyal to me. He manages the day-to-day operations of our commercial properties, including a highly sought-after historic mansion in Midtown known as the Montgomery Estate. It is a stunning, sprawling property with manicured botanical gardens and marble ballrooms. It is also the exact venue Jasmine had aggressively demanded for her wedding. "We received an inquiry over the weekend," Calvin said, sliding a sleek tablet across my desk. "It is a booking request for the Montgomery Estate. The client is requesting a massive luxury package for a summer wedding. The name on the contract is Jasmine Williams." I glanced at the tablet. "She is moving fast," I murmured. Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Your sister, I presume?" She demanded a full walkthrough tomorrow morning. She also sent a rather demanding email instructing our venue staff to allow her personal maid to come along and take measurements for the cleaning crew. "I assume you are the maid," I smiled. A cold, genuine smile. "Yes, Calvin, I am the maid. Approve the walkthrough. I will be there tomorrow with a tape measure. Treat her exactly like the high-paying client she thinks she is, and treat me exactly like the hired help." Calvin chuckled, shaking his head. "Consider it done, but there is a slight issue with the contract guarantee." He tapped the screen of the tablet, bringing up our risk assessment dashboard. "At Sterling and Oak, we do not just book venues. We cater to the ultra-wealthy, which means we run rigorous financial background checks on any client attempting to book our properties on credit or installment plans. Our proprietary software, Vanguard, aggregates public records, banking flags, and property deeds to identify financial liabilities before we ever sign a contract. Jasmine listed your father, Richard Williams, as the financial guarantor for the $150,000 wedding package," Calvin explained. Our software flagged his profile immediately. I thought you should see this before I pushed the rejection notice through. I pulled the tablet closer and pulled up Richard's financial profile. Vanguard had painted a devastating picture in bright red warning flags. I scrolled through the data, my eyes narrowing as I absorbed the numbers. My parents had zero liquid assets. Their credit cards were maxed out to their limits. But that was not what made me stop breathing for a fraction of a second. There it was, a second mortgage on the family home in Cascade Heights. My parents had quietly gone to a predatory private equity firm just 3 days ago. They had taken out a high-interest second mortgage, pulling $150,000 directly from the equity of the house they had spent 30 years paying off. The terms of the loan were absolutely catastrophic. The lender was charging them 14% interest with a balloon payment due in less than 12 months. They had literally leveraged their shelter, their only piece of generational wealth, to buy imported orchids and a 1-0-tier cake. They were risking total homelessness just to prove to Caroline Sterling, a woman whose assets I personally managed, that they belonged in her tax bracket. I stared at the screen, a chilling realization washing over me. They were digging their own grave, and they were handing me the shovel. If Richard defaulted on this loan, the private equity firm would foreclose on the house within weeks. He was playing Russian roulette with his life savings, all while ordering me to scrub floors. "Do you want me to decline the booking?" Calvin asked gently, noticing my silence. "Their debt-to-income ratio is a massive liability. We usually do not approve clients with this kind of predatory debt on their books." "No," I said softly, sliding the tablet back to him. "Approve the contract. Let Richard pay the non-refundable deposit. Let Jasmine have her dream venue." Calvin looked at me, a silent understanding passing between us. "You are going to let them crash," he stated. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the window, looking out over the city. "I am going to let them have exactly what they asked for," I replied. "They want to play the game of wealth and status. I will let them play. Set up the venue walkthrough for tomorrow morning. Make sure the floors are dirty enough for me to mop." Tuesday morning arrived with a thick layer of Georgia humidity. The Montgomery estate sat behind towering wrought iron gates in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. It was a masterpiece of 19th-century architecture featuring wraparound verandas, imported Italian marble floors, and 3 acres of meticulously manicured botanical gardens. It was the crown jewel of my commercial portfolio. Today, it was my sister's personal playground. Jasmine pulled up to the front circle in her leased white Mercedes. She stepped out wearing an oversized sun hat, designer sunglasses, and a crisp linen suit. She looked like a woman who owned the world. I was already waiting by the front steps, wearing faded jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and carrying a yellow plastic bucket filled with cleaning supplies. "Right on time," Jasmine said, tossing her car keys into her designer purse. "Do not just stand there. Grab your bucket and follow me. We have a meeting with the venue manager and the floral designer. I need you to stay out of sight unless I ask for you, but be ready to measure the perimeter of the ballroom." I gripped the handle of my yellow bucket and followed my younger sister up the grand stone steps. The heavy oak doors swung open before Jasmine could even reach for the handle. Standing in the grand foyer was Calvin. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and a warm, differential smile. He looked every bit the elite estate manager. "We had rehearsed this exact scenario over a brief phone call last night," Miss Williams, Calvin said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the Montgomery estate. I am Calvin, the general manager. We are absolutely delighted to facilitate your luxury wedding package. Your father's deposit cleared our accounts this morning." Jasmine beamed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Thank you, Calvin. My fiancé, Julian Sterling, requires absolute perfection. The Steerings are very particular about historic venues. I expect flawless execution." "You have my word," Calvin replied smoothly. His gaze then shifted to me, standing slightly behind Jasmine with my cleaning supplies. His smile vanished, replaced by a look of polite disdain. "And who is this?" "We usually require vendors to enter through the service doors at the back of the estate." Jasmine let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Oh, Calvin, I apologize. This is my sister Jada. She cleans houses for a living, so I brought her along to handle the grunt work today. She needs to measure the baseboards for the custom draping I ordered. And honestly, your floors could use a good scrubbing before my florist sets up her mock displays." I kept my face completely blank. I looked at the floor, playing the part of the humiliated blue-collar sister perfectly. I see, Calvin said, adjusting his cuffs. Well, please ensure she does not disturb the other clients touring the grounds today. We maintain a very high standard here. Of course, Jasmine said, waving her hand dismissively. Jada, go to the grand ballroom. Get on your hands and knees and get me those measurements. Do not come back until you have the exact square footage. I will be in the conservatory designing my centerpieces. I gave a quick nod and walked down the long gilded corridor toward the grand ballroom. The room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from vated ceilings, casting prisms of light across the pristine marble floors. I set my yellow bucket down near a massive bay window and pulled out my tape measure. 10 minutes later, the heavy double doors of the ballroom opened. Jasmine walked in, flanked by Calvin and a high-end floral designer named Vivian. Vivian was holding a tablet, frantically taking notes as Jasmine rattled off a list of absurd demands. I want walls of white orchids, Jasmine commanded, pointing toward the main archway, and a canopy of imported wisteria hanging above the dance floor. If you need to import them directly from Japan, just put it on the invoice. My parents are covering everything. Vivian hesitated, glancing at Calvin. Miss Williams' imported wisteria on that scale will add at least $20,000 to your floral budget. Are you certain your father is comfortable with that adjustment? Jasmine scoffed, crossing her arms. Money is not an issue for my family. We believe in black excellence. Just add it to the final bill. I was kneeling by the baseboards, pulling my tape measure along the wall. I knew the truth. I knew Richard had already leveraged the entire equity of his home just to pay Calvin's deposit. Jasmine was racking up tens of thousands of dollars in add-ons that my parents simply did not have. She was signing their financial death warrant with a diamond-encrusted pen. Calvin excused himself from Jasmine and Vivian, walking over to where I was kneeling on the marble floor. He looked down at me, his expression stern for the benefit of anyone watching. Cleaner, Calvin said sharply, you missed a spot near the eastern column. I need you to review these venue protocols immediately. He knelt down, pretending to point at a scuff mark on the floor. As he did, he slid a sleek leather-bound clipboard onto the marble right in front of my knees. On top of the clipboard was a standard cleaning checklist. But underneath that single sheet of paper were 3 pages of highly classified financial documents. I slipped the documents out from under the checklist while Calvin continued to point at the floor. I scanned the pages rapidly. It was the complete financial breakdown of Jasmine's wedding account. Calvin had highlighted the bottom line. Richard's initial deposit had indeed cleared, but Vanguard had placed an automatic freeze on any further lines of credit. Because of my parents' second mortgage, their credit score had tanked overnight. They would have to pay for the white orchids, the wisteria, and the remaining venue balance in hard cash 30 days before the event. If they missed that deadline by a single minute, the contract explicitly stated the event would be canceled and all deposits forfeited. Calvin also slipped me a printed email. It was a message from Jasmine to a predatory online lender, desperately applying for a $20,000 personal loan. She had been denied. I slid the papers into the pocket of my jeans and nodded at Calvin. I will take care of it right away, sir, I said quietly. Calvin stood back up, smoothing his suit jacket. See that you do? We do not tolerate incompetence at Sterling & Oak. He turned and walked back to Jasmine, who was glaring at me from across the room. She marched over her heels, clicking loudly against the marble. What is wrong with you? Jasmine hissed, standing over me while I remained on my knees. I saw you reading that clipboard instead of working. Are you trying to embarrass me in front of the venue manager? Calvin is a professional. He does not have time to deal with your laziness. I am just following his instructions, Jasmine, I said, keeping my voice soft and subservient. Well, work faster, she snapped. Vivian is waiting for the perimeter numbers. You are ruining my timeline. I swear, Jada, if you mess up this wedding, I will make sure Mom and Dad cut you out of this family for good. You are lucky I even let you inside a building like this. I looked up at my sister. Her face was flushed with manufactured stress, her eyes wild with the desperation of a woman trying to hold together a house of cards. She was standing in my building, yelling at me for taking too long to measure my own floors, while actively destroying our parents' financial future. I will hurry, I said, looking back down at my tape measure. I would not want to ruin your perfect day. Jasmine scoffed in disgust and spun around, marching back to her florist. I stayed on the floor, running my hand over the cool, polished marble. The trap was fully set. The contract was signed, The debt was locked in. My family had demanded I play the role of the help. I was more than happy to oblige, knowing that when the time came, I would be the one sweeping them out the door. I left the Montgomery estate through the service exit, tossing the yellow plastic bucket into the trunk of my car. I drove a few miles down the road to my private club, took a hot shower, and changed into a tailored charcoal suit. I traded my scuffed sneakers for designer heels. Within 45 minutes, the obedient silent house cleaner vanished. The CEO of Sterling and Oak returned. My next appointment was a quarterly portfolio review with my most demanding and highest-paying client. I drove my Porsche through the imposing iron gates of the Sterling family compound in Buckhead. The winding driveway was lined with century-old oak trees, leading up to a massive limestone mansion that looked more like a European fortress than a home. I handed my keys to the valet, walked past the private security detail, and was escorted directly into Caroline Sterling's private study. The study was a testament to generational wealth filled with dark mahogany shelves, rare books, and original oil paintings. Caroline sat behind her massive desk, reviewing a stack of property deeds. She wore a tailored cream dress, her posture rigid and commanding. She was a woman who was used to giving orders and having them followed without question. But when I walked into the room, she immediately stood up, closed the folder in front of her, and offered me a warm, genuine smile. "Jada, please come in and sit down," Caroline said, gesturing to the plush leather chairs across from her desk. "I cannot thank you enough for handling that zoning disaster in the Hamptons last week. My legal team was spinning in circles for months, and your firm resolved it in 4 days. You saved us millions." I took my seat, crossing my legs smoothly. I smiled, opening my briefcase to pull out the finalized contracts. "Efficiency is what you pay us for, Caroline. We identified the local council members blocking your permits, negotiated a community development compromise, and secured your building rights. The paperwork is completely finalized. You can begin construction on the new estate by Monday morning." We spent the next 30 minutes reviewing her commercial real estate holdings, optimizing her tax structures, and finalizing the acquisition of 3 new properties in Savannah. As always, the business concluded flawlessly. I gathered my documents and prepared to leave, but Caroline held up her hand. "Would you mind staying for a moment?" Caroline asked. Her voice had lost its usual sharp, authoritative edge. She sounded unusually hesitant. She stood up, walked over to her heavy oak doors, and instructed her assistant that we were not to be disturbed under any circumstances. She locked the door behind her and returned to her seat. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at me, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I need your advice, Jada, not as my estate manager, but as someone who understands the exact situation I am trapped in right now." I remained perfectly still. I knew exactly where this conversation was heading. "I am listening," I replied softly. "It is about Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And it is about your sister, Jasmine. At the restaurant the other night, when your mother introduced you, I nearly went into cardiac arrest. I had absolutely no idea you were related to them. Julian brought Jasmine home 6 months ago, and she spun this incredible story about her family." Caroline rubbed her temples, looking visibly exhausted. "Jasmine told Julian that your parents came from old Atlanta money. She claimed your father, Richard, was a silent partner in several major commercial development firms across the South. She told us she had a trust fund worth $10 million that she would inherit upon marriage. Julian was completely taken by her. He is a wonderful boy, but he is incredibly naive when it comes to people wanting our money." I kept my expression neutral, though. Inside, I was absorbing the sheer magnitude of Jasmine's lies. My sister had not just exaggerated her public relations career. She had completely fabricated a multi-million-dollar financial empire to trap a wealthy husband. "I am a businesswoman, Jada," Caroline continued, leaning forward. "I do not trust anyone who enters my family's inner circle without verification. Last month, I hired a private intelligence firm to run a quiet background check on Richard and Brenda Williams. I needed to verify the existence of these commercial developments and this supposed trust fund before Julian signed any legally binding documents." Caroline reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a thick red folder. She pushed it across the mahogany desk toward me. "The investigators found absolutely nothing," Caroline said, her voice shaking with restrained panic. "There is no trust fund. There are no commercial developments. Your parents have 0 liquid assets, But what they did find was a brand new, predatory second mortgage on their primary residence taken out at a 14% interest rate just to fund a luxury wedding. They are completely broke. Jada. Jasmine is a grifter and she is trying to secure her financial future by attaching herself to my son. I looked down at the red folder, then back up at Caroline. You know the truth, I stated calmly. Why are you telling me this instead of showing this folder to Julian? Because Julian is blindly in love and he is fiercely protective of her. Caroline explained, her eyes wide with desperation. Jasmine has him completely convinced that she is an independent, successful woman. If I go to him with this background check, Jasmine will play the victim. She will cry and tell Julian that his elitist wealthy mother is trying to ruin their happiness out of spite. She will spin a narrative that I am attacking her family. Julian will side with her. He will marry her out of defiance, and it will destroy my relationship with my only son. Caroline reached across the desk and gently touched my arm. But then I saw you at the engagement dinner. I saw the way your parents treated you. I saw your father tell a room full of people that you scrub floors, completely unaware that you are one of the most powerful property managers in this city. You are the actual wealth in that family. They are nothing but an illusion. You see through them, Jada. Please. I am begging you. How do I stop this wedding without losing my son? I looked at the powerful billionaire sitting across from me, practically pleading for my help to save her family from my own sister. It was a poetic, brutal irony. Jasmine thought she was playing a brilliant game of chess, completely unaware that I owned the board. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I looked Caroline directly in the eyes, my voice steady and cold as ice. Do absolutely nothing, Caroline. Caroline blinked, thoroughly confused. Nothing, but they are defrauding my son. She is going to bankrupt them both. If you attack Jasmine now, you validate her victim complex, I explained slowly, making sure she understood every word. A narcissist like my sister thrives on opposition. If you try to expose her privately, she will twist the narrative and drag Julian away from you. The only way to dismantle an illusion of this magnitude is to let it collapse on its own under the weight of its own lies, and it must happen in public, where she cannot hide behind Julian's privilege. Caroline swallowed hard, processing my strategy. But the wedding is in a few weeks. The deposits are paid. They are moving forward. Let the wedding planning proceed exactly as planned, I instructed her. Let Jasmine continue to spend money she does not have. Let my parents continue to dig their financial grave. Smile at the bridal shower. Nod along during the dress fittings. Do not give them a single reason to suspect that you know the truth. I stood up from my chair, buttoning my suit jacket. I picked up my briefcase, looking down at Caroline with absolute certainty. You hired my firm to manage and protect your most valuable assets, I said softly. Consider Julian an extension of that portfolio. I will not let my family steal a single cent from yours. I will handle my parents. I will handle my sister. When the time comes, I will personally pull the rug out from under them, and Julian will see the truth without you ever having to say a word. Caroline let out a long, shaky breath. The panic in her eyes slowly faded, replaced by profound relief and deep respect. She stood up and nodded. I trust you, Jada, completely. I walked out of the study and navigated the sprawling corridors of the Sterling compound. As I stepped out into the humid Atlanta air and handed my valet ticket to the security guard, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I opened the Vanguard financial software app. The trap was tightening beautifully. Jasmine thought she was securing a lifetime of luxury, and my parents thought they were buying their way into high society. They had no idea they were racing toward a brick wall, and I was holding the only set of brakes. I sat in the driver's seat of my Porsche, the engine idling quietly as the Sterling family's massive iron gates closed behind me in the rearview mirror. The humid Atlanta air pressed against the tinted glass, but inside the cabin, the climate control kept the atmosphere perfectly chilled. I looked down at my phone. The Vanguard application was still open, its interface displaying the complex web of real estate holdings, risk assessments, and financial forecasts that dictated my daily operations. Suddenly, a priority alert banner flashed across the top of the screen in bright crimson. It was an automated ping from our distressed asset monitoring system. I tapped the notification, bringing up the specific file. It was Richard and Brenda Williams, my parents. The system had detected a critical breach in their financial profile. I read through the aggregated data, my eyes tracking the numbers with practiced precision. Richard, In an act of absolute desperation to generate the fast cash needed for Jasmine's absurd floral and venue deposits, had attempted to day trade on margin using a highly leveraged brokerage account. It was a catastrophic gamble. The market had corrected sharply over the past 48 hours, resulting in a margin call he could not cover. To satisfy the brokerage, his bank had automatically drained his primary checking and savings accounts. That catastrophic drain triggered a domino effect. The very first payment on their predatory high-interest second mortgage was returned for insufficient funds. The private equity firm holding that second mortgage, Apex Capital Solutions, was notorious in the Atlanta real estate market. They did not grant grace periods. They did not negotiate with overextended suburbanites trying to maintain a country club facade. Apex operated on a strict, ruthless algorithm. The moment a payment bounced, their system automatically initiated pre-foreclosure default proceedings. My parents were officially in default. The house they had spent 3 decades leveraging for social status was slipping through their fingers. I connected my phone to the car's Bluetooth and dialed my chief operating officer. Calvin answered on the first ring. I told him to pull up the Vanguard alert for the Cascade Heights property. I heard the rapid clicking of his keyboard over the speakers. I see it, Calvin said, his voice dropping into its serious analytical register. Apex Capital is moving fast. They have already flagged the account for accelerated default. Richard and Brenda have exactly 14 days before the public notice of default is filed with the county. Once that hits the public records, it will be visible to everyone. Their credit will be entirely destroyed, and the formal eviction process will begin. Once that notice went public, their financial ruin would be common knowledge in Atlanta. Everyone at their church, their country club, and Jasmine's public relations firm would know they were bankrupt. The illusion of their black excellence would instantly shatter. I assume you want me to authorize a wire transfer from your personal accounts to clear the errors? Calvin asked gently. I can have our legal team contact Apex and freeze the default process. We can save the house quietly without them ever knowing you intervened. It was a logical assumption. Any normal child with my level of wealth would secretly bail their parents out to spare them the humiliation. But my family was not normal, and providing a secret bailout would only enable their toxic behavior. It would allow Jasmine to continue spending money that did not exist, and it would allow Richard and Brenda to continue treating me like dirt beneath their designer shoes. No, Calvin, I said, staring out through the windshield at the tree-lined street. Do not pay off the ARs. If we pay it off, we reset the loan and leave Apex in control. I want you to contact the acquisitions director at Apex Capital Solutions directly. Use our private acquisitions holding company, Sterling Horizon Holdings. Calvin paused. You want to negotiate the debt? I want to buy the debt, I instructed him, my voice perfectly level. Sterling & Oak buys distressed premium real estate debt portfolios all the time. Tell Apex we want to acquire the promissory note and the deed of trust for the Cascade Heights property. Apex will gladly offload a high-risk second mortgage for an immediate cash premium. Offer them 15% above the outstanding principal to ensure the transaction closes immediately. Tell them we want the legal assignment of the deed completed and recorded within 48 hours. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The brilliant ruthlessness of the move was settling in. Calvin understood exactly what I was doing. You do not want to save them from the bank, Calvin said softly, a hint of awe in his voice. You want to become the bank. Exactly, I replied. Execute the purchase order. Consider it done, Calvin said, the sound of his rapid typing resuming. I will have the final assignment documents on your desk by Thursday morning. I ended the call and pulled out into the Atlanta traffic, a profound sense of calm washing over me at forward 48 hours. I was sitting at the custom mahogany desk in my penthouse office. The digital transfers had been completed late Wednesday night, but Calvin knew I preferred to hold the physical documents for acquisitions of this highly personal nature. He walked into my office, carrying a thick manila folder, and placed it squarely in the center of my desk. It is finalized, Calvin stated, adjusting his suit jacket. Sterling Horizon Holdings is now the sole legal creditor and lien holder for the property in Cascade Heights. Apex Capital has relinquished all rights. The county has recorded the assignment. Thank you, Calvin, I said. I opened the folder. Inside was the legal assignment of the deed of trust, heavily stamped and notarized. I looked at the legal description of the property, tracing the printed address with my index finger. This was the house where I had been repeatedly told I was not good enough. The house where Jasmine had been given the master suite simply because she demanded it. While I was relegated to the small drafty room near the laundry area, this was the house where Brenda hosted lavish dinner parties to impress people. She secretly despised, forcing me to serve hors d'oeuvres while she introduced Jasmine as the future executive star of the family. It was a monument to their vanity, a physical manifestation of their obsession with status and appearances. Now, legally and financially, that entire monument belonged to me. The power dynamic had shifted entirely. I was officially their landlord and their sole creditor. I held the absolute power to initiate foreclosure, to serve an eviction notice, and to strip them of the very shelter they had so recklessly endangered to fund a wedding. They had looked me in the eye at an upscale restaurant and told the groom's family that I was nothing but a house cleaner. They had mocked my supposed poverty, yet here I sat holding the deed to their home, holding their entire future in a manila folder. But I would not evict them today. Moving too quickly would ruin the strategy I had carefully outlined for Caroline Sterling. The trap needed to remain hidden until the absolute perfect moment. Jasmine still had a bridal shower to host. She still had caterers to insult and vendors to defraud. She needed to feel like she was winning right up until the second she lost everything. I closed the folder, walked over to the private wall safe, concealed behind a modern art canvas in my office, and placed the deed inside. I spun the heavy metal dial, locking their financial reality away in the dark. I walked back to my desk, picked up my phone, and sent a brief text message to Caroline Sterling. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. Enjoy the bridal shower this weekend. I locked my phone and looked out over the Atlanta skyline. My parents wanted me to clean up their messes. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. Saturday arrived with brilliant sunshine, providing the perfect backdrop for Jasmine's bridal shower at the Piedmont Driving Club. The country club was a bastion of old Atlanta money, featuring sprawling golf courses and dining rooms drenched in crystal and gold. I arrived 2 hours early, not as a guest, but because Jasmine had texted me at dawn, demanding I assist the catering staff. I wore a simple black wrap dress and flat shoes, blending in perfectly with the waitstaff. The solarium room had been transformed into a ridiculous pastel wonderland. Thousands of dollars worth of imported pink peonies cascaded from the ceiling. A custom champagne tower stood near the entrance, flanked by ice sculptures. I knew from my firm's financial monitoring software that the florist had demanded cash up front for this display. That demand had forced my father to drain whatever minimal funds he had managed to scrape together from his remaining credit limits. They were bleeding cash at an exponential rate. As the guests began to arrive, the room filled with Atlanta's upper-middle-class elite. Women draped in designer labels entered the room, displaying their luxury handbags like trophies. Brenda held court near the gift table, greeting her fellow sorority sisters and country club acquaintances. She spotted me organizing a tray of champagne flutes near the bar. Instead of waving me over to join the party, she rushed toward me with her face flushed with anxiety. "Jada, what are you doing standing around?" Brenda hissed, keeping her voice low so the nearby guests would not hear. "Grab that tray. If anyone asks, you are here to assist the event staff. Do not mingle. Do not try to sit at the guest tables. I told my friends I hired you to help out today so you could make some extra pocket money. It is the only way to explain why you look like that." I looked down at my neat, tailored black dress. It was actually vintage Dior, though Brenda completely lacked the eye to recognize it. I did not argue. I simply nodded, picked up the heavy silver tray of champagne flutes, and stepped seamlessly into the role of the hired help. I moved quietly through the crowd, offering drinks with a polite nod. I navigated toward Brenda's inner circle. They were a group of highly judgmental women who thrived on gossip and social hierarchy. I offered a glass to a woman named Cynthia. Cynthia, who was Brenda's closest friend. "Oh, thank you, dear," Cynthia said, barely looking at me. She turned back to Brenda with a wide smile. "Brenda, the shower is simply stunning. Jasmine has done so well for herself. Marrying into the Sterling family is quite the achievement for our community." Brenda pined and adjusted her diamond necklace. "Jasmine has always been highly ambitious. Julian is a wonderful match. They are both highly successful professionals who understand the value of Black excellence. And your other daughter?" Another woman asked, glancing at me as I continued to stand nearby with the serving tray. "I thought you had too." Brenda let out a practiced sympathetic sigh that she had clearly rehearsed in the mirror. "Yes. Well, Jada struggles to find her footing. She does manual labor, house cleaning, event setup, that sort of thing. I actually hired her today to serve drinks so she could pay her rent this month. We try to help her however we can, but you know how it is when a child refuses to apply themselves to a real career. The women murmured in collective pity and shook their heads. It is a blessing she has a mother like you to provide for her, Cynthia noted. It must be so difficult having one child who represents success and another who just cannot keep up. I kept my face entirely impassive. I offered Cynthia a cocktail napkin, smiled politely, and walked away. The irony was a physical weight in the room. They were drinking champagne paid for by maxed-out credit cards. They were praising a mother who was secretly facing foreclosure. And they were pitying the woman who literally owned the deed to the very house Brenda would sleep in tonight. I found an intense, quiet satisfaction in my silence. A hush suddenly fell over the room. Caroline Sterling had arrived. She stepped into the solarium wearing an elegant pearl pantsuit radiating genuine generational wealth. Jasmine immediately abandoned her friends and rushed to greet her future mother-in-law. She fawned over Caroline with an embarrassing level of desperation. Brenda followed right behind her, offering Caroline a seat of honor at the main table. Caroline accepted the seat gracefully. Her eyes scanned the room and locked onto me holding the serving tray. For a fraction of a second, her perfect posture stiffened. I saw the panic flash in her eyes at the sight of her multi-million-dollar estate manager serving cheap, sparkling wine to a room full of suburbanites. I gave Caroline a very slow, deliberate nod. I watched her shoulders relax as she remembered our agreement from her private study. She was to play along and let the illusion run its course until I decided to drop the hammer. I walked over to the main table, lowered my tray, and offered a glass to Caroline. "Champagne, ma'am?" I asked, keeping my tone completely subservient. Caroline looked at the glass and then up at me. "Thank you, Jada," she said. Her voice carried a profound, quiet respect that went entirely unnoticed by my mother and sister. "I appreciate your service." I gave a slight bow of my head and stepped back into the shadows of the room. Jasmine took the microphone at the front of the room to begin thanking her guests for the lavish gifts piled on the table. She spoke grandly about her high-powered career and the luxury honeymoon Julian was planning for them in the Maldives. She projected the image of a woman who had everything under control, but I noticed her hands were shaking. I noticed the way she obsessively checked her phone every few minutes with a look of mounting dread. The facade was flawless on the outside, but I knew the foundation was already crumbling. The bills were coming due, and Jasmine was running out of lies to cover them. I placed my empty tray on the bar and waited for the inevitable collapse. I slipped away from the main bar and pushed through the heavy wooden doors leading into the country club kitchen. The air instantly shifted from the scent of expensive perfume to the sharp smell of commercial cleaner and roasted garlic. I walked over to the stainless steel prep counter to grab another tray of sparkling water. Before I could even pick up a glass, a hand clamped down viciously on my upper arm. I turned to see Jasmine. She yanked me away from the prep station and dragged me into the dimly lit dry storage pantry, slamming the door shut behind us. The contrast between the woman standing in front of me and the radiant bride holding court in the solarium was staggering. Jasmine was hyperventilating. Her immaculate updo was beginning to fray at the edges. Her eyes were wide, manic, and rimmed with red. She was gripping her smartphone so tightly her knuckles were completely white. The screen of her phone was illuminated, displaying a stark red notification from a banking application. My card declined. Jasmine gasped out the words, hitting the dead air of the pantry like a physical weight. She paced the small space between the towering shelves of canned goods and linens. It declined at the bridal boutique this morning, and then it declined again when I tried to pay the string quartet. I crossed my arms over my chest and leaned against a metal shelving unit. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to fill it. I knew exactly why her cards were declining, but I wanted to hear the admission come directly from her own mouth. "I had to buy the custom gown," Jasmine blurted out, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. It was an imported designer piece. Caroline Sterling wore haute couture to her own wedding. Jada, I could not walk down the aisle looking like some cheap off-the-rack knockoff. I had to look like I belonged in their family. It was $35,000. I told the boutique to split the cost across my American Express and my Visa, but they both hit the credit limit. Then I ran Dad's emergency card. The transaction froze his entire account. The bank locked everything down for suspected fraud because he was already over-leveraged. She stopped pacing and shoved her phone directly into my face. "Look at this. Just look at it." I glanced at the screen. It was an automated text message from her premier catering vendor. The message was blunt and unforgiving. If the final $20,000 deposit for the reception menu was not wired by 5 on Friday, the contract would be terminated. The caterers would not even show up to the venue. If the food is not paid for, they are going to walk, Jasmine whispered, her voice cracking with genuine terror. Julian's entire extended family is flying in from Boston and New York. His grandfather is on the board of a major charity. If they show up to an empty reception hall with no food, I will be the laughingstock of Atlanta. Julian will ask questions. He will demand to see the receipts. The whole illusion will be over. I looked at my sister. I felt absolutely no pity. You spent money you did not have to impress people who do not care about you, I stated calmly. That sounds like a logistical problem for you and your wedding planner to solve. I need to get back out there and serve drinks to your friends. Mom made it very clear I am on the clock. I reached for the door handle, but Jasmine threw her entire body weight against the heavy wooden door, blocking my exit. No. She commanded, her tone abruptly, shifting from panic to sheer entitlement. You are going to fix this. You are going to take out a personal loan today. I stared at her, genuinely fascinated by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her demand. She had just allowed our mother to publicly humiliate me in front of Atlanta high society. She had degraded me to her friends and treated me like a servant for hours. Now, trapped in a storage closet, she expected me to finance the very illusion they used to mock me. You want me to take out a $20,000 personal loan to pay for your caviar? I said, making sure to articulate every word slowly so the absurdity could hang in the air. Yes, Jasmine insisted, stepping closer to me. You do not have a mortgage. You live in some cheap, basic apartment. You do not buy designer clothes or take luxury vacations. You literally do nothing with your life, Jada. Your credit score must be perfectly clean because you never spend any money. A bank will approve you for $20,000 instantly. You can get the cash deposited by Thursday and wire it to the caterer. I will pay you back after the honeymoon when Julian and I combine our finances. I let out a short, dry laugh. You are asking me to leverage my credit to bail you out of a financial disaster, right after you spent the entire afternoon telling your rich friends that I am a pathetic house cleaner who relies on Mom for rent money. Jasmine waved her hand, frantically dismissing my point. That was just for appearances. You know how Mom is. We have an image to protect. You owe this family, Jada. We put up with your embarrassing lack of ambition for years. The least you can do is sign a piece of paper so my wedding is not ruined. I looked at her, stripping every ounce of emotion from my face. My voice was colder than the ice sculptures melting in the other room. I am not signing anything, Jasmine. I am not taking out a loan. I am not giving you a single dime. You built this trap yourself. Now you get to sit in it. Jasmine's face twisted into a vicious, ugly snarl. The last remnants of the polished, successful public relations manager vanished completely. She looked feral. You selfish wretch, Jasmine hissed, jabbing her manicured finger directly at my chest. If you do not wire that money to the caterer by Friday, I will destroy whatever pathetic little life you have left. I will go to Pastor Thomas on Sunday morning. I will stand up at the pulpit in front of the entire congregation at First Baptist, and I will tell them that you stole the wedding funds from my bank account. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed by the depths of her sociopathy. You would lie to the church. I will cry at the altar, Jasmine threatened, stepping even closer, her voice dripping with venom. I will tell the entire congregation that my own sister is a thief who ruined my wedding out of pure, bitter jealousy because she cannot get a man of her own. I will tell them you hacked my accounts and drained my savings. They all know you are a failure, Jada. They all know you resent me. Who do you think they will believe? The successful executive marrying into the sterling family or the bitter broke house cleaner? You will be shunned by everyone in this city. You will not even be able to show your face at the grocery store. She stood there breathing heavily, a triumphant, malicious smile spreading across her face. She truly believed she had checkmated me. She believed the threat of social ruin in our community would terrify me into submission just like it terrified our parents. She thought I cared about the opinions of people who judged my worth based on a fabricated job title. I looked at her triumphant smile and felt a profound sense of peace. She had just handed me the moral absolution to destroy her completely. I reached past her, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the pantry door, and pulled it open. The bright lights and sounds of the country club kitchen flooded back into the small space. Go ahead and tell the church whatever you want, Jasmine, I said softly, stepping out of the pantry. But you might want to make sure your venue does not cancel on you first. I walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dark storage room, clutching her phone as her world rapidly continued to burn. I walked away from the pantry door and stepped back into the chaotic rhythm of the country club kitchen. The culinary staff rushed past me, carrying massive silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, completely oblivious to the familial warfare unfolding in their workspace. I walked over to a stainless steel prep counter, picked up a clean linen cloth, and began polishing a row of champagne flutes. I was entirely unbothered. My breathing was slow and steady. Behind me, the heavy wooden door of the pantry crashed open, slamming violently against the tiled wall. Jasmine stormed out. Her face was a mask of absolute unhinged fury. She marched directly toward me and grabbed my shoulder, attempting to spin me around. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply turned my head and stared down at her hand resting on my black vintage dress. The look in my eyes was so cold, so entirely devoid of sibling affection that her fingers instinctively released their grip. She took a half step backward, but her chest was still heaving with manufactured panic before Jasmine could launch into another screaming fit. The swinging doors leading from the main event space pushed open. My father, Richard, strode into the kitchen. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit he had undoubtedly purchased on credit just to impress Julian's wealthy relatives. He looked around the bustling kitchen, his face tightening into a deep scowl, when he spotted Jasmine standing near the prep station, looking visibly distressed. He marched over to us, his heavy leather shoes echoing sharply over the clatter of pots and pans. "What is going on in here?" Richard demanded, his voice thick with patriarchal authority. He placed a protective hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "Your mother is wondering where the guest of honor disappeared to." Jasmine immediately burst into theatrical tears. It was a flawless, rapid transition from pure malice to absolute victimhood. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "She is trying to ruin my wedding." "Dad," Jasmine wailed, leaning into his side for support. "The caterer needs a $20,000 security deposit by Friday, or they are going to cancel our contract." I asked Jada to take out a simple personal loan to cover it just until Julian and I merge our finances. I told her I would pay her back every single cent, but she refused. She is hoarding her clean credit out of pure, bitter spite because she cannot stand to see me happy. She wants me to be humiliated in front of the Sterling family. Richard's face contorted with rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He turned his full wrath onto me. He did not ask for my side of the story. He did not question why his seemingly successful public relations manager daughter was suddenly begging a house cleaner for $20,000. He simply saw a threat to his carefully constructed social image, and he reacted with the blind, arrogant fury I had endured my entire life. "Are you out of your mind?" Richard yelled, stepping directly into my personal space. "You are going to stand there and deny your sister a simple signature at the bank. After everything this family has done for you, after we let you show your face at this country club today." I set the champagne flute down on the counter. I did not back away. I looked him dead in the eye. "You have done absolutely nothing for me, Richard, and I am not financing a party you cannot afford." My father slammed his hand down on the stainless steel counter. The loud metallic bang caused several kitchen workers to jump, but I remained perfectly still. "You listen to me, you selfish, ungrateful girl." Richard spat, his voice dropping into a harsh, menacing growl. "I have worked my entire life to elevate this family name. I have sacrificed everything to put us in the same room as people like Caroline Sterling. Jasmine is securing our legacy. She is cementing our place in Atlanta high society, and you are willing to let it all burn down because you are a stubborn, miserable failure who cleans up other people's dirt for a living. You will march down to the bank on Monday morning. You will sign whatever loan documents your sister needs, and you will wire that money, Clear's throat, to the caterer, or, I swear to you, I will make sure you are dead to everyone in our community." I let him finish. I let him expend all his angry, arrogant energy until he was breathing heavily, waiting for my submission. I calmly folded the linen polishing cloth and placed it neatly next to the glacier. Then I reached under the prep station, where I had stashed my black leather tote bag earlier that morning. I unzipped the top compartment and pulled out a thick, sealed manila folder. I looked at the man who had spent 35 years making me feel like I was nothing but a disappointment. I looked at the man who had just leveraged his entire financial future to buy the approval of strangers. I slid the manila folder across the cold stainless steel counter. It glided smooth against his perfectly tailored suit jacket. "Open it," I commanded. My voice was no longer the soft, subservient tone of a hired helper. It was the sharp, uncompromising voice of a chief executive officer. Richard looked at the folder, momentarily thrown off balance by the sudden shift in my demeanor. He snatched the folder off the counter and ripped it open angrily. I watched his eyes scan the top document. It was printed on heavy, watermarked legal paper. It was the official assignment of the deed of trust for the Cascade Heights property. Attached directly beneath it was the notice of default transferred from Apex Capital Solutions. The paperwork clearly identified Sterling Horizon Holdings as the sole legal creditor and lien holder of his home. Before his brain could even begin to process the dense legal terminology, I leaned across the counter. I kept my voice dangerously low, ensuring every single syllable hit him with absolute precision. "If you ever raise your voice at me again, Richard," I said coldly, "if you ever point your finger in my face or demand another dime from my bank accounts, I will process that default notice immediately. You will be homeless before Jasmine's rehearsal dinner." Richard stared down at the paper. For a few agonizing seconds, the kitchen around us seemed to hold its breath. I watched the gears turning in his head. I watched him try to reconcile the terrifying legal document in his hands with the narrative he had built in his mind. He looked at the corporate holding name. He looked at the massive debt figures. He looked at me dressed in my simple black uniform. Then my father threw his head back and started to laugh. It was a loud, booming, arrogant laugh that echoed off the kitchen tiles. He tossed the manila folder back onto the stainless steel counter with a gesture of supreme dismissal. "Is this supposed to be a joke?" Richard scoffed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You printed some fake legal documents off the internet to try and scare me. You really think I am that stupid, Jada? You think I'm going to believe that a girl who scrubs toilets for minimum wage somehow bought the mortgage to my house? This is pathetic, even for you. This is a new low." Jasmine peered over his arm to look at the paperwork. She let out a cruel, mocking giggle. "She actually faked a property deed, Dad. She has completely lost her mind." "You are sick in the head," Jada Richard said, shaking his head in mock pity. "You are so desperate for attention and power that you are playing make-believe with real estate documents. It is embarrassing. You have until Monday to secure that loan for your sister. If the money is not in her account by noon, do not ever contact us again." He turned around, placing a comforting arm around Jasmine's shoulders. "Come on, princess," he said softly to her. "Let us go back to your guests. We will not let your delusional sister ruin your special day." I stood in silence, watching them walk proudly toward the swinging doors. I slid the manila fold back into my leather tote bag. The trap was perfectly set, and his supreme arrogance had blinded him completely to the incoming destruction. He literally held his own ruin in his hands, and he laughed at it because he underestimated me that profoundly. Richard and Jasmine took exactly 3 steps toward the swinging doors of the kitchen before the heavy wooden panels pushed inward. The brass hinges squeaked loudly, cutting through the ambient noise of the culinary staff. Standing in the doorway was Julian Sterling. He looked entirely out of place in the industrial space, wearing a tailored cream linen suit and a pristine silk pocket square. But it was his face that commanded the room. Julian was raised in a world where raising your voice was considered an unforgivable breach of etiquette. His expression was a carefully blank mask, but his eyes darted rapidly between my father, my sister, and me. "Is everything all right in here?" Julian asked. His tone was perfectly measured, carrying the quiet authority of legacy wealth. I could hear shouting all the way down the service corridor. Jasmine froze instantly. The arrogant, victorious sneer she had worn just seconds prior evaporated. The blood drained from her face so rapidly she looked physically ill. Her hands, which had been resting confidently on her designer purse, began to tremble. She immediately forced a high-pitched, entirely unnatural laugh. She rushed forward, closing the distance between herself and Julian, attempting to loop her arm through his. "Julian, baby, what are you doing back here in the service area? It is so hot and dirty. We were just leaving to come find you." Julian did not smile back. He did not pull away from her, but his body remained rigid and unyielding. He gently stepped past her grip, moving further into the kitchen. His gaze fixed on me, standing quietly by the stainless steel prep counter, and then shifted to Richard. "I heard something about a $20,000 loan," Julian stated, his voice calm but sharp as a scalpel. "I heard something about credit cards being maxed out and someone yelling about a fake property deed. What exactly is going on, Jasmine?" The air in the kitchen grew incredibly thick. I watched my father step in, attempting to deploy the booming patriarchal authority he used to dominate our household. Richard forced a hearty, booming chuckle, clapping his hands together as if dismissing a silly misunderstanding. "Julian," my boy Richard said, stepping toward him with an outstretched hand. "It is absolutely nothing to worry about, just some unfortunate family business. Jada here is having some financial delusions again. You know how it is. She is asking us for money, making up wild stories about owning real estate to try and impress people. We were just setting her straight and reminding her of her place. Please do not let her nonsense ruin this beautiful afternoon." It was a desperate, sloppy lie. Richard was banking on Julian's polite nature to accept the excuse and drop the subject to avoid social awkwardness. But Julian was not stupid. The Sterling family did not maintain their multi-generational wealth by ignoring glaring financial inconsistencies. Julian looked at me. I was standing perfectly still, holding a yellow cleaning cloth. My posture was relaxed. My breathing was steady. I did not look like a frantic woman begging for money. I looked like a woman who was entirely indifferent to their existence. "Is that true?" "Jada," Julian asked me directly, bypassing my father entirely. Jasmine whipped her head around to glare at me. Her eyes were wide with sheer terror, pleading and threatening at the same exact time. She silently begged me to play along to absorb the humiliation to protect her precious facade. For 35 years, I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. I had swallowed their insults to protect their fragile egos. I was done staying quiet. I looked Julian straight in the eye. I kept my tone soft, subservient, and devastatingly precise. "I assure you, Julian, I did not ask my father or my sister for a single dime today," I said smoothly. In fact, Jasmine was just explaining to me that her custom bridal gown maxed out her American Express and Visa cards this morning. She was very distressed about a final catering deposit due this Friday. She asked me to take out a personal loan to cover the $20,000 balance because her credit accounts are currently frozen. I simply declined. I also informed my father that I am not in a position to finance a party. Jasmine let out a piercing shriek. "She is lying, Julian. She is a bitter, jealous liar. She hates me because I am successful and she cleans houses. She is just trying to sabotage my wedding because she has nothing." Julian looked at Jasmine. He looked at the heavy layer of sweat forming on her forehead, disrupting her flawless makeup. He looked at Richard, whose jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched visibly in his cheek. Then Julian looked back at my perfectly calm, unbothered demeanor. The math was doing itself in his head. "The catering deposit is due on Friday," Julian asked, directing the question to Jasmine. His voice was no longer warm or affectionate. It sounded like a corporate auditor asking for a ledger. "You told me the venue and the catering were paid in full weeks ago. You told my mother your father handled the accounts personally." Jasmine stammered her hands, waving frantically in the air. "They are paid. They are. Jada is just making up numbers. She overheard me talking about a minor banking error with the florist, and she twisted the story to make us look bad. Julian, you cannot possibly believe a house cleaner over your own fiancé." Julian did not yell. He did not cause a scene. He just nodded slowly, a dark, thoughtful expression settling over his features. The pristine illusion of black excellence my parents had sold him was officially fractured. The confident, wealthy public relations executive he thought he was marrying was currently throwing a tantrum in a commercial kitchen over a catering deposit. "I see," Julian said softly. He turned to Jasmine. "Let us go back to the party, Jasmine. My mother is waiting for us in the solarium. We have guests to entertain." Julian turned and walked out of the swinging doors without waiting for her. He did not offer his arm. He did not check to see if she was following. He simply walked away. Jasmine let out a panicked gasp and scrambled after him, her designer heels slipping slightly on the tiled floor in her haste. Richard lingered for a fraction of a second. He shot me one last venomous, hateful glare, a look that promised absolute retribution. Then he hurried out the doors after his golden child, desperate to run damage control. I stood alone at the prep counter. I picked up the linen cloth and resumed polishing the champagne flute. The kitchen staff around me went back to their duties. The brief interruption over, I smiled. The crack in the foundation was now a gaping fissure. Julian was suspicious, which meant Caroline Sterling would be informed of the altercation within the hour. My sister was cornered, drowning in debt and running out of lies to cover her tracks. The rehearsal dinner was tomorrow night, and I had just handed them the match to light their own pee. All I had to do now was sit back and watch them burn. Friday evening arrived with the stifling heavy heat, typical of an Atlanta summer. The rehearsal dinner was hosted at the Capital City Club, courtesy of the Sterling family. I walked through the grand entrance wearing a simple, unbranded black dress. It was elegant but understated, purposely chosen to maintain the illusion of my blue-collar struggle. The room was dripping in old money. Crystal chandeliers hung from vated ceilings, monogrammed silk linens draped the tables, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. Jasmine was already there, but she looked like a woman walking to the executioner's block. The Friday 5 catering deadline had come and gone. I knew for an absolute fact the deposit had not been paid. Calvin had informed me at exactly 4:59 that the catering contract was officially voided. Jasmine was currently hosting a rehearsal dinner for a wedding that had no food, no staff, and no venue for the following day. Yet she stood next to Julian, gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles were white, laughing too loudly at jokes that were not funny. Julian was a ghost. He went through the motions of the perfect groom, shaking hands and offering polite smiles to my extended relatives. But the warmth in his eyes was entirely gone. He had not forgotten the scene in the country club kitchen. He had not forgotten the panic in Jasmine's voice or the mention of maxed-out credit cards. He was calculating, observing, and waiting for the other shoe to drop. Brenda and Richard were working the room with a level of desperation that was physically painful to watch. They clinked glasses with Julian's aristocratic relatives, dropping buzzwords about commercial investments and summer homes they did not own. When my parents saw me enter the room, Richard's jaw locked. He had spent the last 48 hours trying to convince himself that the deed I handed him in the country club kitchen was a forgery. He had ignored the legal notices that had undoubtedly arrived in his mailbox. He was living on borrowed time and pure denial, drinking expensive scotch paid for by the very people he was trying to deceive. I was directed by the hostess to a small table near the kitchen swinging doors. I was seated alongside Julian's third cousins, a few bewildered plus ones, and the event photographer. It was the absolute lowest tier of the seating chart, a physical manifestation of where my family believed I belonged. I took my seat gracefully and ordered a glass of sparkling water. Across the room at the elevated head table, Caroline Sterling caught my eye. She was seated next to her son wearing a rigidly structured emerald gown. She raised her water glass to me in a microscopic silent salute. I gave her a fractional nod in return. The board was set. The pieces were perfectly in place. The trap was ready to spring. After a lavish 4-course meal that my family practically devoured, the formal toasts began. Julian's father spoke first, delivering a brief, polite, and thoroughly generic welcome to the Williams family. He spoke about the merging of two worlds and raised his glass to the young couple. Then, Richard took the microphone. He bellowed into it, sweating profusely through his rented tuxedo. He spun a fantastical, embarrassing tale about the Williams family legacy. He talked about generational wealth, corporate triumphs, and how Jasmine was the absolute crown jewel of their empire. I watched Julian's face during Richard's speech. Julian stared directly at my father without blinking, his expression completely unreadable. When Richard finally sat down to sparse applause, Brenda took the floor. She smoothed down her sequined dress, took a deep breath, and beamed at the crowd of wealthy, powerful people. She wanted to cement her status. She needed to prove to the Sterling family that she was sophisticated, benevolent, and culturally elite. When I look at Jasmine Brenda, projected her voice carrying an artificially sweet theatrical cadence, I see the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence. She is a powerhouse executive. She is a woman who commands boardrooms and sets the standard for success in Atlanta. Julian, you are marrying a queen who will elevate the Sterling name and bring honor to both our families. The Sterling side of the room clapped politely. Jasmine offered a weak, trembling smile, looking like she might be physically sick. But Brenda could not stop there. Her monumental ego demanded a comparison. She needed a prop to elevate Jasmine even higher. She needed a contrast to prove just how far her parenting had brought her golden child, and I was sitting right there by the kitchen doors. Brenda's eyes scanned the opulent room and locked directly onto me. She offered a tragic practice sigh, placing a hand over her heart to feign maternal sorrow. Of course, raising children is a journey of highly diverse outcomes. Brenda continued, her voice dripping with weaponized pity. We love all our children, no matter their path in life. My other daughter, Jada, is sitting right back there by the service doors. The entire room shifted awkwardly. Dozens of heads turned to look at me. I sat perfectly still in my simple black dress, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my expression devoid of any emotion. Jada has had a much harder road, Brenda announced to the room of billionaires and socialites. She lacks the ambition and the drive her sister possesses. She cleans houses for a living. It is a blue-collar, tragic life, but it is honest labor. Richard and I have spent our lives trying to financially support her, trying to pull her up from the bottom so she does not end up on the streets. But some people simply refuse to be saved. We invited her tonight because we believe in charity, and we believe in family even when that family is a profound daily disappointment. The silence that slammed into the Capital City Club was absolute. It was not the silence of awe. It was the horrified, suffocating silence of an entire room witnessing a mother publicly execute her own child for cheap social currency. The sheer cruelty of the statement left the Sterling family staring at Brenda with open mouths. I did not lower my head. I did not cry. I did not look away in shame. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact with Brenda. I let her marinate in the profound, heavy silence she had just created. At the head table, Julian looked visibly disgusted. Jasmine buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling under the weight of her impending ruin. But my eyes shifted to Caroline Sterling. The powerful real estate mogul was gripping her champagne flute so tightly the crystal threatened to shatter in her hand. Caroline's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Brenda had just publicly humiliated the woman who managed the Sterling family's entire real estate portfolio. Brenda had just called the multi-millionaire CEO of Sterling and Oak Estate Management a tragic charity case. I watched Caroline's chest heave with one deep, stabilizing breath. She set her crystal glass down on the table with a sharp, resounding clink that echoed across the silent room. The catalyst had been ignited. The sharp, resounding clink of Caroline Sterling setting her crystal glass against the table echoed like a gunshot. The ambient noise in the Capital City Club died instantly. The soft playing of the string quartet faltered and ground to a halt as the musicians sensed the sudden volatile shift in the atmosphere. Every single guest in the opulent dining room froze. Caroline pushed her chair back. The heavy mahogany legs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, a harsh sound that made my mother physically flinch. Caroline stood up slowly. She smoothed the front of her emerald gown with absolute precision, her posture radiating the kind of lethal authority that only decades of unchecked corporate dominance could forge. She did not reach for the microphone. She did not need it. Her aristocratic voice carried perfectly across the dead, silent room. Brenda Caroline said, her tone completely devoid of warmth. "You have spoken quite enough tonight." My mother blinked rapidly. The smug, triumphant smile she had worn just seconds ago began to tremble at the corners. She gripped the edges of the podium, letting out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded like a trapped animal. "Oh," Caroline Brenda stammered, attempting to maintain her breezy socialite facade. "I was just making a motherly observation. You know how it is when we try to guide our children to the right path." I said. "You have spoken enough," Caroline repeated, dropping her voice into a cold, commanding register that sent a shiver through the room. In all my years navigating the upper echelons of society in this country, I have never witnessed a display of such profound, staggering ignorance. At the head, Julian started to rise from his seat, his brow furrowed in deep concern. "Mother, please," he murmured clearly, attempting to de-escalate what was rapidly becoming a social disaster. "Sit down," Julian Caroline ordered without even looking at him. "Your future mother-in-law has decided to make a public spectacle of her family to inflate her own ego. It is only fitting that we address this spectacle publicly." Julian slowly lowered himself back into his chair. He looked at Jasmine, who was hyperventilating beside him, her hands clamped over her mouth as her pristine illusion began to burn to the ground. Caroline stepped away from the head table. She began to walk down the center aisle of the dining room, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. The crowd of wealthy socialites parted for her automatically. She walked directly past the lavish floral centerpieces, past the stunned faces of Julian's extended family, and headed straight for the back of the room. She headed straight for me. Brenda Williams has just introduced her daughter, Jada, as a tragic charity case, Caroline announced to the room, projecting her voice so that every single syllable landed like a physical blow. "She stood up here and told you all that this woman cleans houses for a living. She called her a profound disappointment. She relegated her own flesh and blood to a table by the kitchen, swinging doors to hide her away like a dirty secret. Caroline reached my table. She stopped and stood directly behind my chair. She placed one hand gently on my shoulder, a gesture of profound, undeniable respect that sent shockwaves through my family. I did not move. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, my expression perfectly serene, looking straight ahead at my parents. "Allow me to formally introduce the woman sitting at the service doors." Caroline stated, her eyes is locking onto my father, who is now sweating profusely. "This is Jada Williams. She does not clean houses. She is the founder and chief executive officer of Sterling and Oak Estate Management. She is a self-made multimillionaire." A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Several of Julian's relatives, who had previously been throwing me glances of uncomfortable pity, were now staring at me in absolute wide-eyed shock. Richard dropped his scotch glass. It shattered against the table, spilling amber liquid across the monogrammed silk tablecloth. But he did not even look down. His jaw was slack. His eyes bulged as his brain completely failed to process the words Caroline had just spoken. Brenda gripped her chest, her mouth opening and closing silently as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. "She is not a blue-collar laborer." Caroline continued, tightening her grip on my shoulder. "She is the single most ruthless, brilliant, and highly sought-after property manager in the American South. She manages the private estates of tech founders, politicians, and legacy families. In fact, she is the exact woman who holds the non-disclosure agreements to my family's private real estate portfolio. Just last week, Jada and her firm saved the Sterling family over $12 million in a zoning dispute in the Hamptons. Without her expertise, our latest commercial development would have been entirely liquidated." The absolute carnage unfolding on my parents' faces was beautiful to witness. Brenda stumbled backward, bumping into a waiter who had to catch her by the elbow to keep her from falling. She looked at me, truly looking at me for the first time in 35 years, and she saw a stranger. She saw an empire builder sitting quietly in a plain black dress. "You stood up here and bragged about your family's legacy." Caroline spat, turning her fierce gaze back to Brenda and Richard. "You boasted about your wealth and your status. You claimed to be the pinnacle of excellence. Yet you have spent this entire evening and presumably this young woman's entire life degrading the only actual elite asset your family possesses. Now see here, Caroline." Richard suddenly shouted, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to salvage his pride in front of the other men in the room. "There must be some misunderstanding. Jada never told us any of this. She let us believe she was struggling. This is her fault for deceiving us. Do not speak to me, Richard." Caroline snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "You do not have the financial clearance to breathe in my direction. I ran a comprehensive background check on you last month. I know exactly what your net worth is. I know exactly what you do not have, and I know exactly what predatory lengths you went to just to sit at this table tonight." Jasmine let out a blood-curdling scream from the head table. "Stop it," she shrieked, slamming her fist down on the linen tablecloth. "Stop talking right now." Jasmine's perfect bridal facade was entirely gone. Her makeup was streaked with tears. She looked frantic, cornered, and completely feral. Julian turned to look at her, his eyes cold and analytical. The pieces from the country club kitchen were slamming into place in his mind. The frantic demands for a $20,000 loan, the fake property deed. Julian realized in that exact moment that the deed had never been fake at all. Caroline looked at Jasmine with a level of disgust usually reserved for insects. "Your sister Jada is the only reason I allowed this circus to proceed tonight," Caroline informed her coldly. "She asked me to give you the grace of letting this play out. I wanted to cancel this wedding weeks ago when I found out you were a fraudulent grifter. But Jada has more class in her little finger than the three of you have in your entire fabricated lineage. I respected her wishes to handle her family privately. But after witnessing your mother attempt to publicly humiliate her, I refused to stay silent for another second." The room was completely paralyzed. The high society guests who had been applauding my mother 5 minutes ago were now looking at my family like they were diseased. My parents had spent their entire lives worshipping at the altar of social status, terrified of what the community might think of them. Now, their worst nightmare had materialized. They were completely exposed as abusive frauds in front of the wealthiest, most influential people they had ever met. Caroline looked down at me. Her fierce expression softened slightly. I haven't moved an inch. I haven't gloated or smirked. I simply tilted my head back and looked up at my highest-paying client. "Thank you, Caroline," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. That was a lovely toast. I stood up from my chair at the back of the room. I picked up my small black clutch. The entire dining room watched me as if I were a ghost that had suddenly materialized into a titan. I stepped away from the table and began the slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle toward my parents. The time for observation was over. The time for total demolition had arrived. The sound of my heels against the polished hardwood floor cut through the heavy air like a metronome. Every step I took toward the head felt like the final ticking seconds of a bomb counting down to zero. The whispers from the Sterling family had erupted into a low, frantic hum of absolute shock. Julian's extended relatives were leaning across their tables, their eyes wide, completely captivated by the catastrophic implosion of the Williams family facade. Brenda and Richard were scrambling. The sheer panic in their eyes was instantly replaced by a sickening, desperate attempt at survival. My mother lunged forward, her sequined dress, catching the light as she forced the most grotesque, artificial smile I had ever seen onto her face. "Jada, my brilliant girl." Brenda gasped out, her voice pitching so high it sounded like glass cracking. She reached out trying to grab my hands, but I sidestepped her smoothly, leaving her grasping at empty air. Brenda spun around to face the silent room, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative in real time. "We always knew she had it in her," Brenda announced, projecting her voice to the Sterling relatives. Richard and I applied tough love. We pushed Jada to be self-sufficient. We knew that if we pampered her the way we pampered Jasmine, she would never build her empire. This was our plan all along. We gave her the gift of independence. And look at the magnificent black excellence she has achieved. Richard immediately jumped onto the sinking ship, wiping the heavy sweat from his forehead with a linen napkin. "Absolutely," Richard bellowed, attempting to summon his fading patriarchal authority. "A father knows how to test his children. We built that work ethic in her. We knew she was managing Caroline's properties. We just kept it a secret tonight to let Caroline have the honor of announcing it. It was a surprise for the rehearsal dinner." The sheer unadulterated delusion required to spin that lie was almost impressive. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply looked at my father, with a gaze so entirely devoid of warmth that his booming laughter died instantly in his throat. "Do not insult my intelligence, Richard," I said, my voice slicing through the dining room with surgical precision, "and do not ever attempt to claim credit for the empire I built with my own 2 hands. You did not give me the gift of independence. You discarded me because I refused to be a prop in your pathetic, desperate performance for Atlanta high society. You called me a failure because I chose to build actual wealth instead of leasing it." I stopped walking when I reached the edge of the head. Julian was standing now. He looked physically ill. The aristocratic, polite groom who had smiled through the first 2 courses was gone. In his place was a man who suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of a massive financial crime scene. Jasmine was paralyzed in her chair. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging me to stop. But I was 35 years overdue for this reckoning, and I was going to finish it. I opened my small black clutch. I reached inside and pulled out the thick manila folder I had shown Richard in the country club kitchen, along with a sleek silver USB drive. I walked directly past my mother, past my father, and stopped right in front of Julian. I held the folder and the drive out to him. "Julian," I said calmly, "my sister has spent the last 6 months telling you and your mother that she is a highly successful public relations executive with a $10 million trust fund. She sold you a story of generational wealth to ensure she secured a ring from the Sterling family." Julian slowly reached out and took the folder. His hands were remarkably steady, but his jaw was clenched tight. "What is this, Jada?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "That is the actual financial reality of the woman you are about to marry," I stated. I turned slightly so my voice would carry to the rest of the room, ensuring that every single socialite, every church member, and every wealthy investor my parents had tried to impress heard every single word. "Inside that folder, you will find the bank statements and credit reports. My firm pulled when Jasmine attempted to book my venue for your wedding," I explained. "There is no trust fund, Julian. Jasmine currently has negative $40,000 in available credit. The custom designer bridal gown she has been bragging about all week was split across an American Express and a Visa card, both of which maxed out and declined yesterday morning." Jasmine let out a choked, humiliated sob. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the room erupted into shocked gasps. "But the dress is the least of your concerns." I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Julian as he opened the folder and began reading the highlighted documents. "You will also find a printed email in there from her catering vendor. Jasmine begged me in a storage closet yesterday to take out a $20,000 personal loan to cover the final catering deposit. She threatened to stand at the church pulpit and tell our congregation that I was a thief if I refused to finance her caviar. I declined her generous offer." Julian's eyes scanned the catering email. He looked up at Jasmine, his expression shifting from shock to pure cold disgust. "You lied to me," Julian stated, his voice devoid of any affection. "You looked me in the eye yesterday and swore your father paid the caterer weeks ago. You told me the argument in the kitchen was just a misunderstanding about floral arrangements." Jasmine shook her head frantically, tears ruining her flawless makeup. "Julian, please," she sobbed, reaching out for his jacket. "I just wanted everything to be perfect for you. I wanted your family to respect me. I was going to pay it all off after the honeymoon." "With whose money?" Julian snapped, stepping back to avoid her touch. "My money? You are going to use my accounts to secretly pay off the debt you accumulated trying to impress me? This entire wedding is a financial mirage." Brenda rushed forward, desperate to save the marriage that was supposed to secure her social standing. "Julian, sweetheart, please do not be upset with her," Brenda pleaded. "Jasmine just got a little carried away with the wedding planning. Every bride does. Richard and I have it completely under control. We are covering the venue and the remaining balances. We have the capital." I slowly turned to face my mother. I looked at the desperate, sweating woman who had just publicly announced that I was a blue-collar tragedy. "No, Brenda," I corrected her softly. "You do not have the capital. You do not even have a house." Richard let out a strangled, panicked noise. He lunged forward, trying to grab the folder out of Julian's hands, but Julian swiftly stepped out of reach, his eyes narrowing as he flipped to the second section of the documents. Julian, I instructed, "Please review the final legal document in that stack. It is a public notice of default transferred from Apex Capital Solutions." I looked back at my parents, ensuring they felt the full crushing weight of reality crashing down on them. In order to pay the initial non-refundable deposit for my sister's extravagant venue, I announced to the silent room, "Richard and Brenda Williams went to a predatory private equity firm last week. They secretly took out a $150,000 second mortgage on their primary residence at a staggering 14% interest rate. They leveraged their shelter, their only remaining asset, to buy a seat at this table tonight." The wealthy guests murmured in absolute horror. In their circles, bad investments were a tragedy, but leveraging your primary residence for a party was considered deeply pathetic, reckless behavior. Brenda clutched her chest, her eyes darting around the room, realizing that her social standing in Atlanta was officially dead and buried. "And because Richard is a terrible investor," I continued mercilessly, "he attempted to day trade on margin to cover the first loan payment. He lost. The bank drained his accounts. The very first payment on that predatory mortgage bounced yesterday morning. They were placed in immediate default." Richard pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are a monster," he yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You hacked my accounts. You stole my financial records. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage." I smiled, a slow, chilling smile that finally reached my eyes. "I did not hack anything, Richard," I replied smoothly. "When your loan went into default, the private equity firm put your debt up for sale on the distressed asset market. My holding company, Sterling Horizon Holdings, purchased the promissory note and the deed of trust yesterday afternoon." I took one step closer to my father, dropping my voice so the absolute finality of my words would strike him directly in the chest. "I own your debt, Richard. I own the deed to your house. I am officially your landlord. And the only reason you are not currently standing on the sidewalk with your belongings and garbage bags is because I wanted to wait until this exact moment to tell you." Richard's knees literally buckled. He stumbled backward, catching himself on the edge of the head. The booming patriarch, the man who had demanded I scrub baseboards and threatened to destroy my reputation, was now hyperventilating, staring at me with the sheer terror of a man who realized he had just handed his executioner the axe. Julian closed the folder. The sharp snap of the heavy paper echoed loudly. He did not yell. He did not throw the folder. He simply set it down on the table, his face a mask of absolute aristocratic disdain. He looked at Jasmine, who was weeping uncontrollably into her hands, and then he looked at my parents, who were clinging to the table for physical support. "This is repulsive," Julian stated quietly. The illusion of black excellence, the obsession with status, the country club memberships, and the designer clothes had all been stripped away. The Williams family was completely exposed, standing naked in the wreckage of their own profound financial and moral bankruptcy, and I was the one holding the match. Julian turned his back on my parents, treating them with the exact level of invisibility they had forced upon me for over 3 decades. He focused entirely on Jasmine. The silence in the capital city club was absolute. You could hear the ice melting in the abandoned water glasses on the tables. Jasmine stood trembling the heavy silk of her designer engagement dress, suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Julian spoke with a terrifyingly calm and level voice. He did not yell, which somehow made his absolute disgust even more devastating. He asked her if a single word she had spoken over the past 6 months was true. He recounted the elaborate stories she had fed him, the fake trust fund meetings she claimed to attend, the imaginary commercial properties her father supposedly developed across the South, the lies about why her sister was never around to attend their social events. He detailed how she had claimed I was a tragic stain on their perfect legacy, a high school dropout working odd jobs who refused to apply herself. I stood there listening to the sheer depth of her deception. Julian did not raise his voice, but every word he spoke stripped away another layer of her carefully constructed facade. He told her he did not care about the money. The Sterling family had enough wealth to last 10 lifetimes. He cared about the fraud. He cared that she was willing to bankrupt her own parents and destroy her sister's reputation just to secure a spot in his family's social circle. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and slowly pulled out the velvet box containing the matching diamond wedding band he was supposed to place on her finger tomorrow afternoon. He set it gently on top of the manila folder I had brought, the folder containing her financial ruin. He announced to the room, to his mother, and to my horrified parents that there would be no wedding. He was officially terminating the engagement, effective immediately. Jasmine let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal. It was a guttural, wretched sob that tore from her throat and echoed off the crystal chandeliers. She dropped to her knees right there in the center of the opulent dining room, grabbing frantically at the hem of Julian's suit jacket. She begged him to listen, promising she would pay it all back, promising she would cut our family off entirely if he just stayed with her. It was a pathetic, grayling display that made the wealthy guests avert their eyes in secondhand embarrassment. Julian gently but firmly detached her manicured hands from his clothing. He stepped backward, putting physical distance between himself and the toxic wreckage of the Williams family. He looked at his mother. Caroline simply nodded her expression, radiating fierce approval of her son's choice to walk away from a grifter. Julian turned and walked down the center aisle, heading straight for the exit without a single backward glance. Jasmine stayed on the floor for a few agonizing seconds, watching her multi-million-dollar future walk out the heavy oak doors. Then she slowly turned her head and looked up at me. The devastation in her eyes evaporated instantly, replaced by a feral, unadulterated rage. Her face contorted into a mask of pure vicious hatred. In her narcissistic mind, she had done absolutely nothing wrong. In her mind, I was the villain who had maliciously stolen her crown out of pure spite. She scrambled to her feet, letting out a piercing scream that made the string quartet jump in their seats. She lunged forward, her arm raised high, her hand poised to slap me directly across the face. She threw her entire body weight into the strike, fully intending to leave a permanent physical mark on the sister who had just ruined her life. She never made contact. I did not flinch. I did not step back or cower the way I used to when we were children. I raised my left hand and caught her wrist effortlessly in midair. My grip was like a steel vise locking her arm in place mere inches from my cheek. The kinetic energy of her attack was completely neutralized by my steady, unyielding stance. Jasmine gasped, trying to yank her arm away, but I held firmly, my nails pressing slightly into her skin to ensure she understood she was physically trapped. I looked down into her wide, panicked eyes. The entire dining room watched us, mesmerized by the physical altercation that had just been flawlessly shut down. I leaned in close, keeping my voice dangerously low, so only she, my parents, and the closest relatives could hear. "You will never lay a hand on me again, Jasmine," I said coldly. "The days of you treating me like a punching bag to elevate your own pathetic self-esteem are permanently over. You do not get to throw a tantrum because I refuse to finance your delusions. I released her wrist with a sharp downward motion, forcing her to stumble backward. She bumped into Richard, who had to catch her by the shoulders to keep her from falling over in her designer heels. I smoothed the front of my black dress, entirely unbothered by her pathetic display of violence. I looked at my parents, who were clutching each other, shaking with the realization that they had completely lost control of their children, their finances, and their precious social standing. "You want to be furious about losing your groom?" I said smoothly, my voice carrying across the silent room. "But Julian walking out that door is actually the least of your logistical problems tonight." Jasmine stared at me, her chest heaving, mascara running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. "What are you talking about?" she choked out. I checked the gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8:15 inches the evening. I looked back up at her, offering a cold corporate smile. I informed her that the 5 banking deadline had officially passed. Calvin, the general manager of the Montgomery estate, had been monitoring the venue's accounts all afternoon. I explained that since the $20,000 final catering deposit was never wired to the venue's holding account, the breach of contract clause had been automatically triggered. Calvin had just sent out the internal memorandum to the entire vendor team. I watched the last remaining drops of blood drain from Jasmine's face as the reality of my words hit her. I stated clearly and concisely that her reservation at the historic estate was officially terminated. "The floral designers have been instructed to halt the importation of your white orchids and wisteria," I announced, ensuring my voice resonated with absolute finality. "The catering staff has been sent home. The string quartet has been canceled. The venue doors are currently being locked, and the security team has been given strict orders not to allow anyone from the Williams family onto the premises tomorrow morning." Richard let out a strangled gasp. He stepped forward, leaving Jasmine shivering beside him. "But the deposit," Richard stammered, his eyes wild with financial panic. "We paid $75,000 to secure that date. If the wedding does not happen, we get that money back. We have to get that money back." I looked at my father, savoring the absolute destruction of his arrogance. I shook my head slowly. "No, Richard, you do not," I replied calmly. "The contract you signed explicitly stated that all deposits are entirely non-refundable in the event of a breach of payment. There is no wedding, not just because Julian left, but because you literally do not have a building to walk into tomorrow. The venue has canceled your contract, and as the owner of the property, I have personally authorized my management team to retain your entire deposit to cover the administrative inconvenience." I stood there in the center of the Capital City Club, surrounded by shocked billionaires and horrified Atlanta socialites, watching my family completely collapse under the weight of their own manufactured ruin. They had wanted me to clean up their messes. I was simply following orders, scrubbing their toxic illusion entirely out of existence. I woke up at 6 on Saturday morning without an alarm. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Buckhead penthouse, casting a warm golden glow over the imported hardwood floors. Today was supposed to be the day. Today was the day Jasmine Williams was scheduled to walk down a wisteria-covered aisle and cement her place in Atlanta's aristocratic elite. Instead, I walked into my pristine kitchen, ground fresh espresso beans, and pressed the button on my espresso machine. The mechanical whir was the loudest sound in my apartment. I relished the absolute peace. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop. It was a message from Calvin. I swiped the screen open. He had sent a high-resolution photograph of the front gates of the Montgomery estate. The heavy iron doors were chained shut. A discreet, professionally printed sign was posted on the stone pillar, informing guests that the private event scheduled for today had been permanently canceled. Calvin attached a brief note confirming that our private security team was on site and that 0 unauthorized personnel had attempted to breach the perimeter. The caterers had unpacked nothing. The florists had never arrived. The historic mansion was as silent as a tomb. I replied with a simple message thanking him for his flawless execution. I poured my espresso and walked out onto my terrace, letting the warm morning air wash over me. I opened my email applications. The digital fallout from last night was already spectacular. Julian had not waited for my parents to spin a face-saving lie to their country club friends. He had taken absolute control of the narrative before the sun even rose. He had sent a mass email to the entire wedding guest list at 3:00 inches the morning. I had received a forwarded copy from a mutual acquaintance who was absolutely reeling from the shock. Julian's message was a masterclass in polite, devastating honesty. He informed the hundreds of invited guests, many of whom had flown in from across the country, that the wedding was canceled effectively immediately. He did not use vague terms like irreconcilable differences or a mutual change of heart. Julian explicitly stated that he refused to legally bind himself or the Sterling family to individuals who operated on profound financial manipulation and deliberate cruelty. He apologized for the travel inconvenience, but made it entirely clear that the massive deception he had uncovered the previous night made the marriage permanently impossible. He had effectively blacklisted the Williams family from every prominent social circle in the South with a single click of a button. While Julian was likely flying out of Atlanta on his family's private jet, my sister was descending into absolute madness. The notifications on my phone began to multiply rapidly as Brenda resorted to text messages. I did not answer her phone calls, so she flooded my screen with frantic, unhinged updates. Jasmine was barricaded inside the bridal suite at a luxury downtown hotel. Brenda typed that Jasmine had pushed a heavy velvet sofa against the door and was refusing to let anyone inside. Jasmine was entirely hysterical. She was trapped in a room surrounded by confused bridesmaids who had woken up to Julian's email and were demanding answers she could not provide. The elite hair and makeup team had arrived at 7 inches the morning, only to be turned away at the lobby because the credit card on file for their services had been flagged for severe fraud. Jasmine was sitting on the floor of a hotel room she could no longer afford, staring at a $35,000 designer gown she could never wear, knowing that her entire community was waking up to the reality of her lies. Brenda's text messages shifted from demanding that I unlock the venue to begging me to send cash for the hotel bill. The hotel management had caught wind of the canceled wedding and the frozen credit accounts. They were threatening to involve local authorities if the bridal suite balance was not settled by the standard checkout time. Brenda pleaded with me, claiming that Jasmine was hyperventilating and tearing the bridal suite apart in a fit of rage. She begged me to show some sisterly compassion, conveniently forgetting that just 12 hours ago she had stood on a stage and called me a blue-collar tragedy. I read the messages with total emotional detachment. I placed my phone on silent, set it face down on the outdoor patio table, and took a slow sip of my coffee. For 3 decades, my parents had cultivated an environment where Jasmine's comfort was their only priority. They had sacrificed my peace, my dignity, and their own financial stability to ensure she never had to face the consequences of her actions. Today, gravity had finally caught up with them. There was no safety net. There was no backup plan. They were free-falling in broad daylight. They had demanded that I clean up their messes. They had handed me a yellow bucket and told me to scrub the baseboards of their illusions. I was simply following their instructions. I was cleaning the toxicity out of my life, sweeping away the leeches and the liars with ruthless efficiency. I finished my espresso and walked back inside my penthouse. I had no intention of responding to Brenda's desperate pleas for cash. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Once the hotel management forced them out of the bridal suite, they would have nowhere else to turn. Their credit was completely destroyed. Their social standing was eradicated. They would have no choice but to come crawling directly to the only person who held the deed to their salvation. I set my coffee cup in the sink and waited for my doorbell to ring. The chime of my private elevator security console broke the quiet of my kitchen exactly 2 hours later. I walked over to the digital panel mounted on the marble wall and pressed the intercom button. My downstairs concierge, a highly trained former military contractor named David, spoke with crisp professionalism. Miss Williams, David stated, "I have a Richard and Brenda Williams in the lobby. They are requesting immediate access to your residence. They are highly agitated, but they claim it is a family emergency." "Send them up, David," I replied smoothly. I unlocked the elevator override and stepped back into the center of my living room. I did not sit down. I did not prepare beverages. I stood perfectly straight, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, waiting for the polished steel doors of my private elevator to open. When the doors parted, the 2 people standing inside looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant socialites who had strutted through the Capital City Club the night before. Brenda stepped out first. Her usually immaculate hair was flat and frizzy from the humidity. She was wearing yesterday's makeup smeared and settled into the deep lines of panic around her eyes. She wore a rumpled tracksuit, a shocking departure from her usual designer labels. Richard followed close behind her. The booming, chest-puffing patriarch had completely evaporated. His shoulders were slumped, his posture defeated. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of a single morning. They stepped onto my imported hardwood floors and stopped staring at the sheer undeniable magnitude of my wealth. They looked at the soaring 20-feet ceilings, the custom modern art hanging on the walls, and the unobstructed panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline wrapping around the entire penthouse. This was not the cheap, basic apartment Jasmine had accused me of living in. This was an empire, Jada, Brenda whispered, her voice cracking as she took in the space. We had no idea. You never asked, I replied. My voice was perfectly flat. State your business, Brenda. I have a very busy schedule today. My mother flinched at the coldness in my tone, but desperation quickly overrode her pride. She rushed forward, stopping just a few feet away from me, her hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. It is an absolute nightmare, Brenda sobbed, tears spilling over her eyelashes. The hotel management called the police this morning. They forced their way into the bridal suite and escorted Jasmine out of the building. They are threatening to press charges for defrauding an innkeeper because the credit card on file bounced for the final room balance and the damages she caused. Richard stepped up beside her, swallowing hard. He could not bring himself to look me in the eye, so he stared at a spot on the wall just past my shoulder. The bank called my cell phone an hour ago, Richard said, his voice thick with humiliation. They flagged the remaining credit accounts for severe delinquency. Word is already spreading through the country club. Several board members have stopped returning my calls. We are completely ruined, Jada. We have absolutely nothing left. I looked at the two of them. I felt no pity. I felt no satisfaction either. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound clarity. They had spent their entire lives running on a treadmill of financial toxicity to impress people who fundamentally did not care about them. Now they had stumbled and the machine was tearing them to pieces. And what exactly do you want me to do about it? I asked quietly. Brenda reached out, attempting to grab my hands, but I took a deliberate step backward. She dropped her arms, her face twisting in pure desperation. You have to save us, Jada, Brenda pleaded, her voice rising in panic. You have millions of dollars. You own properties all over the city. You have the power to fix this instantly. We need you to pay off Jasmine's credit cards before the hotel presses charges. We need you to clear the venue cancellation fees. And we need you to tear up that default notice on our house. Richard finally looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading. If you just clear the immediate debts, we can salvage this, he insisted, still clinging to the pathetic illusion of his social standing. We can tell the community that Julian was intimidated by our success. We can spin a public relations narrative that Jasmine broke it off because the Sterling family was too demanding. We can save our reputation in Atlanta, but we need your capital to do it. You have to bail us out, Jada. We are your family. I stood in the center of my penthouse, listening to my father beg me to finance a public relations campaign to cover up his financial crimes. I was not asking for forgiveness. He was not apologizing for decades of emotional abuse. He was not expressing an ounce of remorse for publicly degrading me in front of the Sterling family just last night. He was simply asking me to buy him a new mask so he could continue lying to his friends. They had learned absolutely nothing. The total collapse of their world had not humbled them into self-reflection. It had only made them more desperate to maintain the lie. I looked at Richard. I looked at Brenda. I let a long, heavy silence fill the massive living room. I wanted them to hear the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I wanted them to feel the absolute terrifying stillness of standing in a room where their manipulation no longer held any power whatsoever. You walked into the Capital City Club last night. I began, my voice dangerously soft, and you told a room full of billionaires that I was a tragic charity case. You told them I lacked ambition. You told them you had given up on me. Brenda let out a choked, terrified sob. Jada, please. I was just trying to protect Jasmine's image. I did not mean it. You meant every single syllable. Brenda, I corrected her sharply. You spent 35 years making sure I knew exactly how little you valued my existence. You sacrificed my mental peace to build an altar for Jasmine. You demanded that I take out a $20,000 loan to buy her caviar. And when I refused, you threatened to destroy my life. I took a slow, deliberate step toward them. They both shrank back instinctively. You sat at that restaurant and laughed when Richard told me to go scrub the kitchen floors to pay for your luxury meal. I continued, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. You told me my only purpose in this family was to clean up the messes you created. I turned around and walked over to my marble kitchen island. I picked up a crisp white envelope that had been sitting perfectly centered on the counter all morning. I walked back to my parents and held it out toward my father. Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He did not reach for it. His hands remained frozen at his sides. "Take it, Richard," I commanded. With trembling fingers, he reached out and took the envelope. He opened the flap and pulled out a thick legal document. I watched his eyes scan the bold black text at the top of the page. I watched his breathing stop entirely. Brenda leaned over his arm, reading the document alongside him. She let out a horrific, shattered gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. Richard stared at the heavy cardstock. The official seal of the Fulton County court system glared back at him in stark black ink. He let the paper slip from his trembling fingers as if it were burning his skin. It fluttered down and landed it face up on my marble kitchen island. I reached out and slowly slid the official eviction notice right back across the cool stone, stopping it directly in front of his hands. "That is a formal 30-day notice to vacate," I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings of my penthouse. "Your default on the predatory second mortgage is absolute. As the sole owner of the debt through Sterling Horizon Holdings, I am executing my legal right to foreclose on the property. You have exactly 1 month to pack whatever belongings you can fit into a moving truck. On the 31st day, my private security team will arrive at Cascade Heights to change the locks." Brenda let out a ragged, breathless wail. "You are evicting us," she sobbed, clutching the edge of the marble island to keep her knees from buckling. "Your own mother and father. Jada, you cannot do this. We will be homeless. We have no savings left. Where are we supposed to go? You should have thought about your living arrangements before you leveraged your only shelter to buy imported flowers for a wedding that was never going to happen," I replied smoothly. "But since you want to talk about family and loyalty, let us take a quick trip down memory lane. Let us revisit the engagement dinner at the Monarch Room." I took a step closer to the island, leaning my weight forward as I locked eyes with my father. "Do you remember sitting across from Caroline Sterling?" I asked, dropping my voice into a lethal, quiet register. "Do you remember the sheer unadulterated joy on your face when you looked at me and told the wealthiest family in Atlanta that I was a complete failure? You laughed. You handed me a $4,500 dinner bill and told me to go scrub the restaurant kitchen to pay it off. Mom proudly announced to everyone who would listen that I clean houses for a living. You both looked the groom's mother dead in the eye and said, you had completely given up on me." Richard swallowed hard. He tried to look away, but my gaze kept him pinned to the floor. "You gave up on me," I repeated, letting the words hang in the heavy air between us. "You spent my entire life treating me like a disease because I refused to perform for your country club friends. You demanded that I take out a $20,000 loan to fund Jasmine's delusions, and when I refused, you threatened to destroy me in our community. You told me I was a miserable disappointment. You told me I was dead to you. We were angry." Jada, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of his total ruin. "People say things they do not mean when they are stressed about finances. We were just trying to secure a future for your sister." "No, Richard," I corrected him sharply. "People reveal exactly who they are when they think they hold all the power. You thought you held the power. You thought I was a pathetic, broke housekeeper you could bully into submission. You thought Jasmine was your golden ticket to generational wealth. You decided I was disposable, and you treated me accordingly." I turned my attention to my mother. She was weeping openly now, her tears ruining the last remnants of her carefully applied makeup. "You wanted to impress the Sterlings so badly, Brenda," I said. "You wanted to prove your black excellence. Well, look at you now. You are standing in a penthouse you could never afford, begging the daughter you threw away to save you from a financial crisis you created entirely by yourselves. You wanted me to clean up your messes. I am simply following your instructions. I am cleaning up my property portfolio, and that requires removing the toxic liabilities living inside my assets." Brenda reached across the marble island, her hands shaking violently. "I carried you for 9 months, she cried out, attempting to play the ultimate card of maternal guilt. "I gave you life, Jada. You owe us. You gave me life. And then you spent 35 years trying to make me regret it." I shot back, my voice devoid of any sympathy. "You do not get to cash in on biology when the bank comes calling. I owe you absolutely nothing. I am officially evicting you. You will pack your clothes, You will pack your fake designer bags. You will take Jasmine, and you will figure out how to survive in the real world without a luxury facade to hide behind. Richard's fists clenched at his sides. A brief, pathetic spark of his old arrogance flared up in his chest. His face turned a dark shade of crimson as he glared at the eviction notice on the island. I will strip that house to the stud, Richard threatened, his voice dropping into a desperate growl. I will tear out the copper wiring. I will smash the imported fixtures. I will burn that place to the foundation before I let you take it from me. I did not even blink. I stood perfectly still and offered him a cold corporate